and I have with me Kyle Beshears, who is a Mormon historian from the Baptist minister's point of view. About how long ago did you see the movie?
2 weeks ago now.
And it was Heretic.
When we met. It was Heretic. Yeah.
What did you think about the movie?
Yeah. So I don't like the horror genre, but I'm keenly aware of how Mormonism is portrayed in popular culture. So that was the draw for me. I wanted to see, kind of knowing the synopsis of the film and what it was going to be about, or what I thought it was going to be about. I wanted to be aware of how Mormonism was being portrayed, especially with it being two young sister missionaries in this horror film. My assumption going into it was that they were going to be these young, naive women that are just toyed with by some kind of evil mastermind and religion. Yeah, belittled, mocked in roundabout ways. You know, the opening scenes, it didn't leave me feeling any better. I thought that was the trajectory we were going. But I was 30 minutes into the movie, my guard fell, and I realized that the directors and the writers were doing something completely different than I've ever seen before with Mormonism and popular culture. And that was portraying them as convicted in their beliefs, regardless of what you think about them, and actually being the protagonist heroes of the story, not just being props to be punched around by some kind of evil antagonist. So it got my attention, and it ended up being, all in all, I believe, a really good film and one of the best psychological thrillers that I've ever seen.
Yeah, there's a lot of, somebody said, wow, those sister missionaries have to act scared for like an hour and a half.
Yeah, that's right. The acting was phenomenal. Everyone, even Topher Grace, who plays an elder or a bishop or somebody coming to check in on the sister missionaries. Everyone did.
We can do spoilers if you want, because we're going to just say anything. So what did you think about the comparison to Monopoly?
That was really clever. So if your audience hasn't seen it yet, there's going to be a sequence in the film where the antagonist, Mr. Reed, who is, the best thing I could describe him is this kind of post-new atheist, materialistic, naturalistic, evil man who has a deep disdain for religion and faith.
Only because he studied it for 50 years. No, I'm just
kidding. Correct. Only because he studied it. Well, and I think there's an undercurrent of hurt that he had by religion at some point in his past that is never addressed, but it's only slightly alluded to, which is a common theme. As a pastor, I see it. He's going through and he's explaining his theory of the development of religion by likening it to different iterations of Monopoly. The first being one that nobody's ever heard of, that was created by a feminist woman. The second one being the one we're all familiar with. The landlord game is then picked up by a man who sees its potential, sells it to Parker Brothers. Is that right?
After a redesign.
And then after a redesign, and then it has that familiar layout that we all know. And then you have like an additional iteration of Monopoly after that, which is themed specifically to a place or a location. The final iteration he calls the zany regional spinoff, with a picture of Bob Ross on the front. And as you have these 4 iterations being developed, he likens them to the Judeo-Christian tradition as it develops, first from Judaism, then to Christianity, then to Islam, and then finally the zany regional spinoff is Mormonism. He plops the Book of Mormon down next to a picture of Bob Ross, which, if it's an iteration of Monopoly, the choosing of Bob Ross, I think, is an important point there, because everybody loves Bob Ross, but let's be serious, he's a bit goofy, and he's kind of making it up as he goes along. And I think that's the subtle critique that the antagonist is giving about Mormonism. As far as it being an iteration, is that what you're asking me? Like, what do I think about his theory of iterations?
Sure.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing to think about, because for Mormonism, especially when it comes to like the gospel, as it's understood in their faith tradition, covenants made with Adam in the garden, ordinances passed on from dispensation to dispensation. There's really, at the core, not a lot of wiggle room to permit iteration or development as far as those things are concerned. So that was one of the thoughts that popped into my head, like, how would a Latter-day Saint understand what the writers or the directors are trying to say? From a Christian perspective, though, I have less of a problem with iteration, especially within a religious tradition. My faith tradition has grown as revelation has increased. So, for example, if you're talking about like the difference between the Old and the New Testament, the most obvious iteration of God's self-disclosure to the world is the incarnation, death, and resurrection of his son. If that man claimed to be truly God and truly man, what does that mean? Well, it takes the church 400 years to finally articulate the doctrine that we know today as Trinitarianism. So that layering on, or that adding kind of an understanding of who God is and what God is doing and what he plans to do in the future, that bothers me less than I think the antagonist, if I was in their situation, would have wanted. But for a Latter-day Saint, like, I'm not really sure how they would, even if the writers and the directors it knew what they were poking at when they said these things kind of develop as they move through time.
That's right. And even for Christianity, the 400 years included snuffing out smaller movements and not being successful all the way. There's the Roman Catholic Church, there's the Ethiopian Orthodox, there's the Coptic, right? Just
Sure,
like for Mormons, there's the Utah Brighamites, there's the Community of Christ that used to be called the Reorganized Latter-day Saints, and there's the FLDS, sort of as the three major branches. And I read somewhere that there was like 300 different iterations of Mormonism, of which there might be a few dozen that have more than 30 members or something like that.
Yeah, or less. Stephen Shields has a great book. It's in its 5th edition right now. That traces a lot of those movements, and it might even be more than 300 if memory serves me correctly.
That's right. Well, thanks, Kyle. We'll share this with our show, and hopefully other people will comment on it and